This has massive implications for the Toronto Blue Jays as the regular season is inching closer and closer to its completion. The Blue Jays have some major questions that they need to answer during the offseason, and a recent article has dropped giving some light on which players are going to be headed out of Toronto. So to break down that article, discuss what it entails, and discuss how this impacts the Blue Jays, not just this offseason, but going into the future as well. So I'm going to stay tuned for all that and much more on this episode of Jays Digest. Welcome in, everybody. I am your host, Nick Gosse. Welcome. Obviously, the Jays just had a very bad, weird, horrible defensive game against the Atlanta Braves. They lost that one. But at this point, the Jays aren't really competing for a playoff spot. There are some silver linings. Obviously, Spencer Horwitz has been elite. Probably have a video covering him some point soon, but heading into what is the final weeks of the season, as the Jays unfortunately aren't going to be playing October baseball, some big question marks are heading into this offseason, quite frankly. And the Jays have some major overhauling they need to do. They need to make some big signings. But the biggest question marks are which Blue Jays that are currently under contract are going to return. Let's just dive right into it. So an article dropped by MLB writer Eric Truden. He said 5 players who are entering their final days on the Blue Jays. Obviously, we know that Ross Atkins came out and said the Jays want to compete in 2025, but they're not going to be able to get there with their current roster. And this is obviously was evident in the fact that this season has been an absolute disaster for the Toronto Blue Jays. Probably worst case scenario, the only positive signs that some of their prospects are playing well, and they restocked their farm system, but they shouldn't have even been in a position to restock their farm systems. Let's go over these players, and a couple of them are very interesting, and some of these Jays might be headed towards their final days as Toronto Blue Jays. And let's start with one of the more obvious ones, which is Bichette. Now, obviously, he hasn't played in a very long time. So Bichette hasn't appeared in a game since July 19th as he nurses another calf injury. We know that. He's starting to build back up. Maybe he'll play for the last few games of the season. He's having a very poor offensive year in his limited games, and OPS down to 69. And we know that if you rewind back, even when the Jays were doing well in the months prior to his injury, he seemed uninterested and lethargic in the diamond. It might be because of the trade rumors. He might have been unhappy. Obviously, Peter and I have discussed this ad nauseum. He seemed uninterested this year. Now, we don't know Bo Bichette personally. We know guys like Dan Shulman, Buck Martinez say that Bo Bichette is much different. He's perceived a lot, not worse, but different than he actually is. He actually cares about his craft a ton, and I fully believe that. I'm not attacking Bo Bichette's character by any means, but he did seem a little bit uninterested in, I wouldn't say lethargic, but that's what this article says, lethargic on the diamond. And maybe it's because the Jays weren't winning. Maybe it's because of the trade rumors, losing team. We all know that Bo Bichette wants to win, and ultimately, the Jays weren't winning this year, and part of that was because of Bo Bichette and his absence, so it's very interesting, but like we've discussed on this channel as well ad nauseum, not the first time we've discussed such a thing as one of the more notable reporters in all of MLB, Mark Feinstein, came out and said in an interesting piece that consisted of him polling executives around the league, I sense there's an interest, quote, on their part to move Bichette. Buying a guy out of his Arab years and not extending him further sends a message that either he or they have concern past the 6 years they have him. So, I mean, he hasn't been extended up until this point. The season is inching closer and closer to its completion, like I keep mentioning. And Bo Bichette is still without a contract extension. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is still without a contract extension. All signs point towards Vladdy extending, but Bo Bichette is the biggest question mark going forward, and I would not be surprised in the slightest if this is his last year as a Toronto Blue Jay, just given the fact that we look through it, he has not produced this season, which doesn't really affect anything going forward for the Toronto Blue Jays. I think Bo Bichette, we can all agree that Bo Bichette's a very, very good player, and one down year won't affect his performance next year, hopefully. But he just doesn't seem like he wants to be there as much as he once did. Now, obviously, the Jays want to win. He wants to win. But it seems like the Jays could look to trade Bo Bichette and really just retool around them. So let me know in the comments your thoughts are on Bo Bichette. But let's move on to the next one now. And this is another very interesting one, and it is in the form of Chris Bassitt. Now, this is a guy we haven't really discussed much about leaving. And the article basically goes on to say that this one's a bit tricky, but nearly every time Bassitt has taken the mound lately, it seems like a guaranteed loss for the Blue Jays. A signing that was curious at first, we're going to quickly look like a win for the Jays. He's now 35 years old. He's put up a 4.3 ERA, 9.13 this year. He's still a very solid pitcher, but do the Jays begin to think about moving on from Chris Bassitt? I don't think so, simply because they are trying to compete next year. That being said, he's 35 years old, and we've discussed on this channel about how their starting pitching staff, which was once elite just a couple seasons ago, and even last year was very solid, is starting to turn a little bit now into a bit of an aging core. You have Kevin Gausman, you have Chris Bassitt. Those are two of your better pitchers who are now aging. Obviously, you have guys hopefully coming up. You have players like prospects at that point, like Jake Bloss, Ricky Tiedemann in 2026. You do have José Berríos who's on the younger side, and he's going to anchor that rotation going forward. You also have Alek Manoah, but I think keeping Chris Bassitt around probably makes sense. He did hit 200 innings last year. It was unbelievable. 33 starts last season for the Jays, so he's done his job, but it's an interesting one to discuss because Chris Bassitt is a very intriguing name, and I'm sure he would be on the trade market as well. Kind of just thinking about what's going to happen going forward with Bassitt and Bichette are very interesting because they cleared house this trade deadline, and it seems like no other players or no player on the Blue Jays is safe aside from Vladimir Guerrero Jr., who even they shopped at this year's deadline as well. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Chris Bassitt, and as we go through this list, let me know which player you think is most likely to be gone or headed out of Toronto. Now let's get into some of the more intriguing ones that we haven't discussed here on the channel as much, and Zach Pop. And we obviously got Zach Pop in a trade a while ago, and it's something we've touched on, the writer has touched on before. He hasn't been great at the MLB level. In 66 appearances over the past 2 years, he combined for a 6.16 ERA, and he really hasn't been the player that we once thought he was going to be. He is going to become arbitration eligible for the first time in his career. A non-tender seems like the most likely outcome. So it seems like Zach Pop, who pitched in today's game against the Atlanta Braves, it seems like Zach Pop is headed out of Toronto. And there's going to be a lot of guys on the Toronto Blue Jays, whether it's bullpen pieces that are fighting for a spot that the Jays might look to non-tender, might look to kind of, shed some of the fat that is left on the Toronto Blue Jays to really help retool that bullpen, because that bullpen has been one of the worst in baseball, if not the worst in baseball. And part of that's because of injuries, part of that's because they traded off some of their good guys, but ultimately they need to retool the bullpen. And speaking of the bullpen, we now have Erik Swanson. So this one's very interesting, and Peter and I discussed this one. It's a bit of a tricky one because obviously he had the horrific accident with his the incident that happened with his son, and that kind of threw off his entire spring training regime. He was obviously with his son for a while there, which perfectly obviously makes sense and is fine. And this is a bit of an interesting one. You can see here, it's not Swanson's fault the results haven't been there for him this year. With spring training that was cut short due to a serious accident involving his son, Swanson's head was nowhere near in the game as the season got underway, which clearly led to a lapse on his in-mound performance. And ultimately, what happened was he started the season with the Jays, didn't pitch well, got sent down to Buffalo, and then was really bad in Buffalo, and has kind of started to gain his traction a little bit with the Jays back this season towards the second half. But does Erik Swanson potentially head out? Obviously, these are a lot of guys that are middling relievers. Now, Swanson was one of the main reasons the Jays even made the playoffs last year. He was obviously a very integral piece to that Teoscar Hernandez trade, him and Adam Macko. And he was one of the reasons, if not, a huge reason as to why the Jays made the playoffs last year. 66 games or something like that, tons of innings, very good, low 3s ERA. So at some point, a lot of these guys are going to have to go. The reason we're looking at a lot of bullpen players is because these pitchers have not performed up to standard at all. And that's going to ultimately lead to them having to completely overhaul it. But let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on this. Out of these guys, which one do you want to see out of Toronto, and which one do you think is most likely to head out? Let me know. We'll see you guys tomorrow.